Meng Haoran, a feast at the house of Daoist priest Meng on Qingming Day. Resting in my woodland home, mourning the end of spring. I opened the door, looked out on the shining scene. Suddenly, a bluebird messenger arrived, inviting me to the house of red pine. Cinnabar was flaming in a crucible. The peaches of immortality were about to bloom. If we could hold on to that glowing moment, how we'd cherish the wine of rosy clouds. So we have here a poem by Meng Haoran. The topic of the poem is meeting with a Daoist sage. So it's a social event, a party, a feast, the title says, at the house of this Daoist priest. So a social event, and as part of one of the many social poems that classical Chinese poets used to write, it will be a slightly superficial piece which will flatter in different ways the recipient, the host of the poet. And this is very clear in this poem, and this is done through the use of a lot of Daoist imagery. This poem is completely infused with Daoist images and ideas, which we will comment upon when we explain the couplets one by one. So there is a sub-theme, you could say, which is the retired life, because in the poem it is clear that Meng Haoran, as well as that Daoist priest, are living away from civilization, or at least from city centers. And there's also a seasonal element. It's spring. The title refers Qingming Day. Now, Qingming is one of the traditional Chinese festivities. It was held 15 days after the spring equinox. The spring equinox is usually the beginning of spring. That would be about the 20th of March in our calendar. And so 15 days later, so clearly inside April, would this festival take place. Qingming was a festival for homaging the dead. So on that day, the Chinese visited the tombs of deceased relatives and honored them, burnt incense, and did some rituals at the cemeteries. And also one of the customs of Qingming is not lighting a fire for the food for at least 3 days. That's why it's also called, or it is related to a previous festival that was called Cold Foods Festival. Now, Qingming here only acts, as far as I'm aware of, as a seasonal reference. I mean, the poem doesn't contain any indication of the rituals of Qingming. Perhaps it can be perceived as setting a slightly mournful tone, which makes itself felt in the first couplet of the poem. Okay, so having said that, as usual, let's take a look at each of the couplets of this pentasyllabic regulated poem. First couplet. Resting in my woodland home, mourning the end of spring, I opened the door, looked out on the shining scene. So the poet starts in his environment. He's in his house, in his woodland home. Remember that Meng Haoran lived most of his lifetime in retirement in the area, I think, of Hubei, close to his original area. I think it was Lushan Mountain, but I'm not quite sure right now. Anyway, he's there in his retired life. And he says, mourning the end of spring. This line disconcerts me a bit. Why would you be mourning the end of spring when less than a month has passed since its beginning? I mean, there were some problems of calendrical adjustment in traditional China, which made the beginning of the year should be the beginning of spring, but it was, sometimes altered, and intercalary months had to be added to the calendar. But I interpret this as the reference to the Qingming festival. It's not that spring is finishing. It's that the Qingming festival is taking place, and this makes the poet aware of death, of the passage of time, perhaps of the end of his spring, of his youth, and of its aspirations more than the end of this seasonal spring. Anyway, he goes out, opens the door, and sees a marvelous, a shining, a bright spring scene. Spring is generally the most praised season in Chinese poems, the most beautiful season, full of light and of greenery. Those images of light are important in the poem. We have a shining scene in the second couplet, in the second line, sorry, and we have a glowing moment in the seventh line. So images of light, appropriate for the season. So what happens? This is the background. The second couplet, which is the first parallelistic couplet, will explain us what alters this routine, what leads to the feast at Priest May's house. Suddenly, a bluebird messenger arrived, inviting me to the house of red pine. So, some sort of a message or messenger must have been sent to Meng Haoran's house. He beautifies it through two Daoistic images. He says, a bluebird messenger arrived. Bluebirds, acting as messengers, were sent by a Daoist deity, the Shiwangmu, the Queen Mother of the West, who lived in a remote western mountain at the edge of the world, and who was able to grant immortality to her visitors or followers. So a Daoist deity, which would be relevant or adequate to quote in a poem dedicated to a Daoist priest, inviting me to the house of red pine. Red pine is one of the Daoist transcendents, one of the Xian, I think they're called. So Daoists believe that one, through different religious, ascetic, meditation, and culinary practices, can achieve immortality, can become a transcendent person. And one of these figures, one of the elevated persons of Daoist lore, is Master Red Pine. So here he is, Meng Haoran is flattering Daoist priest Mei, naming him as Red Pine, so associating him with this mythical Daoist sage. So I've received an invitation from priest Mei, turns into I've received a heavenly summons through the bluebirds to visit the great Daoist immortal Red Pine. The next couplet, the second parallelistic couplet, follows a very similar line. It will also include images from the meeting, which are also Daoist images. Cinnabar was flaming in a crucible. The peaches of immortality were about to bloom. So what were the sights at Priest May's house? So cinnabar was flaming in a crucible. One of the main Daoistic practices was alchemy. So Daoists believed that they could concoct elixirs of immortality, and as medieval European alchemists did, they also tried to discover formulas for turning base metals into gold, which was an equivalence to granting humans immortality, turning base metals into the immortal, incorruptible metal gold. So even though they were not particularly successful at this, many Taoist sages and priests did practice alchemy, and they achieved some interesting discoveries, some dangerous discoveries as well. So there was this belief that cinnabar, which is a compound of mercury, which is used for painting, which gives a very shiny, bright red, was one of the ingredients of the potions or the elixirs of immortality. Big mistake. Mercury is highly poisonous, and more than one emperor died after, and thousands, if not more, of Taoist priests died from ingesting cinnabar. But anyway, the picture that's painted here is just as Meng Haoran enters Priest May's house. You know, he sees cinnabar being boiled in a crucible, so the stereotypical image in a Taoist priest's home, just as one would expect to see a Buddhist scroll or a statue of the Buddha in a Buddhist monastery. And the peaches of immortality are about to bloom. Perhaps outside the house there are peaches that are about to bloom, But the reference is to the peaches of immortality, which connects with the previous reference to the Queen Mother of the West. Every 3,000 years, the Queen Mother of the West gave peaches of immortality to the gods to prolong their immortality. So they were a mythical fruit that gave eternal life. The conclusion. So the conclusion emphasizes the pleasure of enjoying Priest May's company, and again it includes a subtle Daoistic image, which is juxtaposed on what Meng, Haoran, and Priest May would have done, which would have been discussing and drinking perhaps a little bit of wine. Wine is also associated a lot with Daoistic practices, at least in part. If we could hold on to that glowing moment, how we'd cherish the wine of rosy clouds. Now, the wine of rosy clouds seems to be a reference to some immortal drink, some wine distilled by the immortals or created by Daoist sages. But the meaning of the poem is quite clear. If we could stop time, if we could hold on to this wonderful, pleasant moment, how nice life would be, how we could enjoy the different pleasures of the immortals. So this wine of rosy clouds is a parallel to our Western and classical Greek nectar and ambrosia. How we could enjoy the food and drink of the gods if this instant could last forever. So that's the typically poignant note in a poem about banqueting and feasting that usually appears, the lament at the fugacity of the company and the good pleasure. But here, of course, it acquires Daoistic overtones. After all, Daoists did believe that they could hold on to glowing moments, that immortality was achievable, at least in theory. Also, this rings a poignant note with the Qingming day being the day of their meeting, a day which commemorates the dead, makes it doubly poignant, doubly pathetic for lamenting how pleasures go away, how they disappear. So, not a bad poem by Meng, a bit on the conventional side of it, but interesting, especially if you're interested in Daoism and Daoistic imagery.